Welcome back, everybody. In this video, I want to talk a little bit more about ordering numbers. So we've seen about ordering numbers on the real number line, mainly focusing on integers. So those whole numbers, but also including the negatives. But we can also graph fractions or decimals and compare those as well using inequality symbols. So I just want to do a couple examples with some fractions and decimals here. And I'm just going to start by drawing my real number line. And remember, our center is typically at 0, which is called the origin here. Now you have your positive numbers on the right. And I'm only going to write in my integers, but all the other numbers are there too. Right, so even though our tick marks are going by units of 1 here, in this particular example, there's still all values in between. There's no gaps in the real number line. So for instance, the fraction 1/2 is right here, right? 1/2 is between 0 and 1, it's halfway between. And if you're having trouble with your fractions, an easy way to figure out the value is to just use your calculator. So let me bring up my calculator. And this is just a calculator app I have on my phone. And let's say I'm just a little bit stuck and I'm not really sure what number that is. Well, I can just type in 1 divided by 2 for 1/2. See that? And hit enter, and it should, oh, hang on, I gotta change my mode here. Let's see. Let's do my answer. So I just hit I have an app for the TI 8384 calculator series. So if you're getting an answer not in the form that you want, if you hit the mode button, you can actually specify. So I can specify I want my answer as decimal, for instance, instead. And it will give it to me that way. Now my calculator is being a little bit weird here. That's giving to me in scientific notation, which I also don't want. So I'm going to change that to normal. And let's try one more time. There we go. So kind of a little sidetrack there, but if you have the TI 83 or 84 series at home and you're entering values, I know this happens to a lot of students and you're getting it in a weird form, and you're like, that's not the answer I'm looking for, then check out that mode button. And you can just kind of play around. You can specify if you want your answer as a decimal or fraction. For decimals, typically you want it in the normal form unless you're doing something like scientific notation. So I just fixed that there. And we can see that 1/2 is the same thing as 0.5. And if there's no number out front, there is a 0 there. So sometimes that helps because then you can see that it's going to be after the whole number 0, but before the whole number 1, right? Now 1/2, I think we're all familiar with, but if you have a more complicated fraction that maybe you don't know as well, so maybe I have something like, let's go off to the side, 7 3/5. Now I know this is off my number line. I'm just doing an example here. So what you can do, again, using your calculator, is you leave the 7, and then if you just type in 3 divided by 5, you can get that decimal equivalent. So I can just tag on that 0.6. So just kind of an easy way if you're having trouble, like I said, figuring out where these values go. So let's say I have something like 2 1/3. If I type that into my calculator, I'm going to get about 2, and then that third ends up being a 3 that ends up repeating. So it's going to keep repeating forever. And we often do use a bar to show a repeating value. And on my number line, I'm just going to estimate it. So I know that 0.3 is not quite a half, right? It's less than 5, that 0.5. So I'm just going to put it a little bit less than a half here. And that would be 2 1/3. Okay, so we just estimate if we're graphing things like fractions or decimals, and we can do negatives as well. So I'll just do one more here. All right, so maybe I have something like negative 1.82. Well, just be a little bit more careful here. So if I was positive, 1.82 is between 1 and 2. So because it's negative, it's going to be between -1 and -2. And it's closer to the 2 value. So I'm just going to put this closer to -2 here. So maybe it's about right there. Okay, and we can just estimate that way. You just want to be careful with your negatives. Remember that the larger the positive value would be, actually the more negative it is. So the further it goes to the left on that number line. Now, as you're comparing values, you still have that idea that positives are bigger than negatives. So for instance, negative 1.82 is less than 0.5 automatically because negatives are always smaller than positives. If you're comparing two values of the same sign, so for instance, two positives, then you can use that number line if you find it helpful. 0.5 is less than 2 1/3. So what you want to remember is that you have larger numbers on the right of the number line. And we have smaller numbers. And remember, this symbol here, it's not just hashtag, it also means number on the left of the number line. So the way I remember it is I sort of think of left means less. So that's just a nice tip. If you're not really sure and a visual helps you, you can always use that number line and that can help you figure out which numbers are bigger or smaller than the others. Again, that can be helpful. One last thing I just kind of want to point out here. Of course, we could also add in things like roots. So we could simplify them. Maybe we would use our calculator. So let me get a different color out here. Maybe I had something like the square root of 2. Now that doesn't come out even, but I can use my calculator. And I do have a square root key on my calculator. It's this one right here. It's in yellow. So if you're using the TI 8384 series, what you would do is hit that second button first and then hit that key so that the yellow option gets selected. And then I can just hit the number 2 and I can get an approximation. So it's about 1.414. And this was positive, so it's going to be on the right side. So a little bit less than 1.5. So we can estimate our roots as well. And if a root does come out even, you'll see that on your calculator. So if I were to do something like the square root of 4, which we know should be 2, you will see a nice whole number answer. So if you get a whole number answer, you know you actually do have some sort of integer value there. One other little tip with the calculator, if you do not have a more structured calculator app on your phone, of course, you could just use a regular calculator at home. That is fine too. I tend to like my phone because I always have it with me. And the other thing is if you have the iOS of an iPhone, and let me see if I can get it to, so here's your regular standard calculator that you bring up on the iPhone. If you turn that to the side, you actually will see a much larger calculator there. A lot of people don't know that that's there. So you actually do have your square root key here. You do have your exponent keys as well. So you can do a little bit more, even just with that standard app that probably comes on your phone. The last thing I want to talk about with ordering is just to watch out for decimals. So if you're dealing with decimals for a second, one way to compare decimals is to just line them up vertically. So for instance, let's say I'm looking at the decimal 1.7321, and I want to decide, is it less than or greater than 1.7324? Now, if this is something familiar to you, you probably know the answer right away. But if you're struggling, then what you can do is you line these up vertically, lining up by the decimal point. So for instance, I would just put one on top of the other. And I would just write nice and big just so I can stay organized. And what you do is you just look column by column. So I'm looking for where they're different. So here, the 1s are the same. Here, the 7s are the same. Here, the 3s are the same. The 2s are the same. And then now I finally see a difference in the two numbers. And the 4 is definitely bigger than the 1. So that means this whole number is bigger than the other one. So 1.7321 is less than 1.7324. And just looking at another example here as well. So maybe I have 4.72 and 4.90. If I line these up by the decimal point, again, I just compare. So these are the same, and now I finally see a difference. The 9 is bigger than the 7, so this number is going to be bigger overall. And again, just be careful. I'm dealing with positives here. If you have negatives, the more negative your number is, actually the smaller it's going to be. So instead, if I had something like negative 4.72 and negative 4.90, well, if I take away the negative, that 4.9 is bigger. So when I put the negative in, it actually becomes smaller because it's moving further left on the number line. So just watch out for those negatives because they can change things around. And if you're having trouble seeing that, the best thing to do is to graph it on that number line. And then you can see the left side means less.